come to find out, I was just getting really bad coaching, mainly because this person probably needed to get themselves back into this type of work and they weren't there yet. They weren't able to really coach me in the way I needed to be coached. And I couldn't tell. I had no point of reference that wasn't working. So it was just worked out that person needed to take a leave and me to report to the boss who I was supposed to be like scared of, who became like a lifelong mentor and friend. And again, once I got to them and I heard what they were looking for, I could easily translate that into the work. That was an early hiccup for me and just I don't think I've ever had an experience like that since.
Welcome to Career Cheat Code. In this podcast, you'll hear how everyday people impact the world through their careers. Learn about their journey, career hacks, and obstacles along the way. Whether you're already having the impact you want or are searching for it, this is the podcast for you.
All right. Michael, welcome to the show.
Hello, how are you?
Doing well. How are you today?
I'm doing great.
All right, good. I'm excited to talk to you today. You and I connected back during our master's program and kind of stayed in touch here and there. And I know you're out in the West Coast now, so I'm excited to really hear about how your career has continued to progress since then. So
definitely.
Yeah. So let's dive right in. Let's tell the world what it is you do for a living.
So what I do, I work for Meta Platforms, formerly known as Facebook. I lead up marketing insights for WhatsApp. So what that means is I'm a marketer and I've been a marketer for the last 20 years. And how I focus my time on WhatsApp is do work to help inform strategies for marketing campaigns, as well as help inform the team around who our core consumer is and how to build experiences in the app that reinforces our brand positioning. So I work with other people who do research as well, like UX researchers, but the research that I do and that my team does is more focused from a marketing standpoint in how to build WhatsApp as a brand.
Awesome. So what does that mean? Are you trying to basically position WhatsApp for other organizations to come in and do some marketing within the app, or some branding within the app, or some partnerships within the app? What is the ultimate goal here?
Great question. So there's two sides of the coin when thinking about kind of anything at Meta. There's the consumer side and then there's the business side. So I'm on the consumer side. So it's all about how consumers interact with the app as opposed to businesses that might try to use WhatsApp or other products that Meta sells to help businesses get in contact with end consumers. So I'm all focused on building the brand in the minds of our consumers and really make people want to have long-term loyalty to the brand and hopefully, which I think they do, get a lot of value out of what our brands can offer.
Absolutely. And, I have some WhatsApp groups that are going off and literally on my phone right now. And that is my main form of communication with a lot of relatives. So, I'm very much an active user. So I understand the value in having such a global platform that is able to connect people. Is this what you always wanted to do for a living?
I had no idea what this type of work was when I was a kid. I grew up in a household with one parent who was in law and had a law degree, and one parent who was a social worker and had a social work degree. So neither one of them knew any folks who were in market research or marketing insights. I don't even know if they had friends that were marketers. I can't think of any of my parents' friends growing up who worked in that area. A lot of their friends, if they did work in the private sector, were attorneys, which is just a very different type of work than what I do. So I had no idea what it was. I went to college wanting to be an attorney and eventually a politician. And by the time I graduated, I was starting out in this specific field of marketing insights, market research at Procter & Gamble. So, so this was definitely not on my radar.
Okay. So tell me about where'd you grow up? What was your kind of upbringing like? And when you were in high school and thinking about potentially law and other things, what was your thought process going after graduation? Like, were you going to college? What were you doing?
So I grew up in Philadelphia and my family has very long roots in the city. Growing up, my mom's childhood aspiration was to be an attorney. And I would go with my mom to work, to visit. At a certain point, she was in the Good administration, who's the mayor, Wilson Good, in the 80s in Philadelphia, and she was in his administration. I remember as a little kid, I got to shadow him one day and literally went with him from event to event and spent time in his office as he had meetings. I have a picture of me as I was probably 7 or 8, sitting behind the mayor's desk. And that was what my goal was. I went to college and I told my professors, I'm going to be the mayor of Philadelphia one day. Yeah, so that was what it was going to be. And then I met some of my mom's friends who were different types of attorneys and would learn from what they did. When I was in high school, I had an externship with a family friend who was the head of government relations for the
Mhm.
local HMO. So that also got me thinking about different things to do in the political realm.
What is an HMO?
So HMO, Health Management Organization, so Blue Cross. So this is the person who ran all of government relations for the Blue Cross HMO in the Philadelphia region. And
Uh,
so, the primary insurer for everybody in the Philly area. So I grew up going to high school in the area and then left to go to college in Connecticut. And the thought was after 4 years of college in Connecticut, I went to Wesleyan University, that I would come back to Philadelphia and, go to law school there potentially, or at a minimum after law school, come back to Philadelphia and practice law and then eventually find some way to get into politics. Eventually, my mom left the mayor's administration, became a judge, and in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, all judges are elected. So I had some experience having a family member who had run for elected office, knew other people who were elected officials. And so that was kind of what I knew, and went to college with that on the brain. Got involved in student government, became a freshman representative in student government. By my sophomore year, I was vice president of student government. I went into a major that was known for people at my university to go to pre-law. It was a very small interdisciplinary major called the College of Social Studies.
Hmm.
So it focused on history, economics, government, and philosophy. So very similar to like Oxford's PPE program, politics, philosophy, and economics. And it was considered like pre-law. Like you got a lot of reading. There was a lot of Socratic method used in some of the like classroom discussion. And so it was like, okay, I'm doing that. That's going to prepare me for law school. And all the while, when I was in high school, I was not contacted, but Inroads, the internship program focused
Mhm.
on, helping minorities get into corporate America, came and they said, we have great internships. They pay really well. And I thought, well, it can't hurt while I'm waiting to do this law school thing to try to get a great internship at a company. And maybe that's a good experience to have if you're one day going to be an attorney, potentially doing like corporate law. So I got an internship through Inroads with Procter and Gamble, and it was in
Hmm.
sales. And at first, I mean, you couldn't tell me that I didn't have the best internship in the world. It paid really well for being someone who just got out of high school. It was the first summer was between senior year of high school and freshman year of college. I
Hmm.
got a company car, company credit card, laptop, work from home. And this is like, this is decades before COVID, work from home. And I had a manager who was really nice. He was in the Philly area. I checked in with him a few times a week. I went to grocery stores and checked on their inventory, learned about Procter and Gamble's products. They make things like Dawn, Tide, Always, Crest, you name it. They make, hundreds of consumer packaged good items.
Mhm.
And it was great. They had an office in North Jersey that I would drive up to regularly. So I'm like 18 years old with access to a car for the summer, corporate card, laptop, work from home. So a lot of flexibility.
Wow.
It was great. Did I love what I was doing? Not necessarily, but just the idea of just having all that freedom was amazing.
Mhm.
And throughout college, I kept my internships going, and they were all in sales. But
Hmm.
by the time it was all said and done, by my senior year, two of my four internships were in Philadelphia, where I'm from, but two were in headquarters in Cincinnati. And when you go to
Hmm.
headquarters, you're meeting people in a lot of different functional areas who do things that are broader than sales. And so it opened my eyes to all these different areas that I never thought about: corporate finance, marketing, product supply, you name it. And by my last summer, I received a sales internship, a sales full-time offer. And I knew at that point, after 4 summers in sales, that I did not want to do sales. And I knew I didn't want to go to law school because I was like,
Oh.
if I do go, it's not going to be right now. I don't even know if I want to be a lawyer. I don't think I want to I don't think I want to sit around and read thousands of pages in law school, and definitely not, in the first couple of years of at a law firm where you're doing document review and just reading incessantly. It's like, that is not what I consider fun. So I told P&G, I was like, thank you for the sales offer. I heard you have some market research roles open, which I found out through someone who I knew who was full-time. And they said, yeah, we do, but you have to interview all over again for that. But you're welcome to. So I interviewed again and ended up getting a second offer from Procter and Gamble in market research.
Wow.
Still didn't really know what it was because I didn't do that during my internship, and I only had like a loose affiliation with someone who did do that. But I knew it was marketing, quote unquote. And it wasn't sales. And it
Hmm.
was in the headquarter office. And that's kind of what I wanted. I didn't want to be working from home right out of school. I wanted to be in an office environment and doing something that was marketing focused, that at least in my mind at that time felt more strategic. In
Oh.
hindsight, there are a lot of areas of sales that are strategic, but what I was exposed to was very like, we give you a script, you go execute against the script, and eventually you'll work your way to something more strategic.
Mhm.
Whereas what I saw in front of me with market research was a chance to do something with driving strategy, like very early on in my career. And that was my first exposure. And
Wow.
that's how I ended up there. And inroads is a big factor in that. And then
Hmm.
once I got in the door, just networking with the right people to even know to ask to be interviewed in that area.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a lot of courage and understanding at a young age, right? To think about, I'm not just, you could have just taken the first job that came to you and said, okay, I'll figure it out after that, right? But you decided to say, I'm going to put myself back in the process. I'm going to try to give it a shot to switch into a career that I don't even really know what it is, but I know that it's not what I've been exposed to so far. And you were willing to relocate, right? Like there were a lot of factors in there that were just not something that I know I wouldn't have been able to conceive at that point in my life, right? So that's, those are pretty big decisions that you were able to undertake early.
Yeah, you hit on the 2 points. Like one of it was the ability to relocate, and that's one that I take for granted. But I guess I always thought as somebody who grew up in Philadelphia with a family all rooted in Philadelphia that I'd eventually come back there.
Hmm.
But for some reason, going off to college then opened my mind to, well, I don't have to live here forever.
Right.
And I didn't dislike Philadelphia, so I had no reason. I wasn't running away from it. Again, that's where I thought I'd go back to. But it just opened my eyes to people from different places, to going to different places. Once I went to college, I remember volunteering on a presidential campaign for Bill Bradley and going to New Hampshire for a couple of weeks to canvass. And I was like, where are you going? And I just bought a plane ticket and flew there to canvass. But again, the minute you get out of being in the same place, then going anywhere else is like easy. I studied abroad. I went to West Africa and studied in Ghana for a semester. I was actually there during 9/11, which was really like just a very different experience, not being in the United States during something as kind of pivotal to how the nation started kind of reforming the thing. And it all started with just going someplace else for college.
Okay, so you take this first job and you end up moving to Ohio. And you're at the corporate headquarters as your first job out of college. Tell me about what your responsibilities were. What did you learn about market research? Was it what you were looking for? Was it disappointing? And how did that play out?
So my first few months were like my head spun. I had a boss who I met on my first day of work, seemed very nice. And at this point, I don't have any real experience other than intern managers, which are very different to assess like where I am with my manager. Like, are they good? How to like read them? And in hindsight, I found out my manager was not great. My manager probably had challenges themselves. And knowing what their background was, working in that context was actually kind of new for them. They had done more of a support role for quite some time. And I probably was close to getting fired in my first few months of working. I would deliver work and it was regularly sent back, like marked up, like a lot. And I could not figure out how to translate the feedback into a meaningful output. And I thought it was me. I was gaining a lot of weight because I was just literally eating all the stress. I'm in this new city. I think I even interviewed for another job somewhere in case this one wasn't going to work out. And then lo and behold, my manager went on leave. And I'm not sure why they went on leave, but they went on leave. And I started reporting to my manager's manager. And at that point, I'm like, oh my gosh, because my manager had made my manager's manager seem like the person who was like, the quote unquote bad guy who was giving all this negative feedback that she kept trying to help me with. And the help wasn't working. And I remember the first time I delivered something to my new manager, who was my former manager's boss. And she's like, oh, this is good. She's like, oh, here's a couple changes to make. And finally, we kind of had a heart-to-heart. And she's like, I don't know what was going on before, but what I'm getting from you, it feels very different than what I got from you before when this other person was managing you. Come to find out, I was just getting really bad coaching, mainly because this person probably needed to get themselves back into this type of work, and they weren't there yet. They weren't able to really coach me in the way I needed to be coached, and I couldn't tell. I had no point of reference that wasn't working. So it was just worked out that person needed to take a leave and me to report to the boss, who I was supposed to be like scared of, who became like a lifelong mentor and friend. And again, once I got to them and I heard what they were looking for, I could easily translate that into the work. That was an early hiccup for me in just like, I don't think I've ever had an experience like that since.
Oh.
But it was humbling. And I learned a lot from it. And that's kind of how it started. And from there,
I mean,
things kind of moved really fast.
Yeah, I mean, it seems very necessary too, right? Like we wouldn't know that. And that's a very tender point in your career, right? Like your first job out of college, having a supervisor that is giving you negative feedback consistently or feedback that you don't know how to reconcile could very well have deterred you from the career, right? Like you could have easily said, okay, maybe I'm just not good at this. Maybe this is just not going to work out for me and I need to figure something else out. So I'm just glad that you were able to stick with it and were able to like recognize that and be put in a situation where other folks received your work and accepted it and embraced it and kind of gave you some of that encouragement to continue from there.
100%. Like if it wasn't for that, I probably would have said, you know what, let me go to law school. I probably would have said that. Because that's the area that I knew and that I'd always said for so long. But that definitely kind of put me on a different trajectory and also helped me understand not to always take what one person says as gospel. And it doesn't mean that other people can't give me constructive feedback and I not take it to heart, but it means to look where it's coming from. And since I didn't know then how to assess, was my manager able to give me the feedback I needed? And there are instances where people's managers are not the best people to give them the feedback they need. Then they have to seek those people out. Doesn't mean your work is right and your manager doesn't know. It just may mean they're not the ones to help get you to the place where you need to be and where your work needs to be. So how to assess to figure out who that person is. I didn't know who it was even right after that, but at least I got to the next boss was the right person.
Right.
And the boss after that was the right person. And then as I got more autonomy and then I got to a place in the future where I had managers who didn't do what I did. And that's a very different type of job when the manager does not do your functional work. They're in a different functional role and they're just leading you. And so it helped me figure out, then who do I go to for feedback that I need with a functional mindset if my manager is not in the same function as me? Absolutely. And so now I know how to go, like, who's the best person I should review things with and get their feedback and their perspective.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And, that's very pivotal. And then you also gained a friend and a lifelong mentor, as you mentioned. So that kind of all worked out. Great.
Exactly.
So tell me about, in terms of the work, so what did you actually enjoy about now being in market research? And what were some of the parts that you were like, I could kind of do without that?
Parts I enjoy, you're really helping figure out what's the opportunity and like how to develop what the right strategy is. At first, people say, I help one strategy, I'm strategic, I do this strategic work. I literally remember having projects that help form the relationship. Like I remember my second role at Procter & Gamble, I was on the CVS customer team. So I worked with sales, but I still was doing market research. And I developed an analysis to say what the opportunity was between Procter & Gamble and CVS that eventually worked its way into an analyst call.
Wow.
That CVS had with when they were giving their earnings and talked about the upside opportunity of partnering with Procter & Gamble. And I knew that I just remember sitting at my desk, kind of figuring out what this analysis was across various product categories with their focused consumer. And it just really made me feel like the work I did was meaningful. The parts that I did not always love is there's a lot of detail when you're doing market research, especially early in your career when you're managing the projects from day to day. There's a lot of detail and a lot of little things that if they go left, they can throw off your results. They can make it challenging to build confidence in the work that you're doing. And so you have to be very detail oriented. And I would not always say that I'm the most detail oriented person, but when I have to be, I can. And so those are some elements that I don't love, but they're necessary in order to be able to move the work forward. And over time, you can get away from some of the details, but you still have to be aware of them so that you can ask the folks on your team how those details are being managed so you can make sure that they're being able to deliver work in the way it needs to be delivered.
Tell me about what happens after this first role. How long were you there? At what point did you make a move and why?
I was in that initial role for about 2 years. And then at the 2-year mark, the manager who had come in and really helped me out, she went to a different role and she recruited me over to her team. And it allowed me to actually transfer and leave Ohio and move to Boston. At that time, I was like, I kind of want to get out of Cincinnati. It just was not, I totally get why people love that city, but it just was not for me.
Mm.
And I wanted to get back to the East Coast. Eventually, I wanted to get to New York, but Boston was close enough as far as I was concerned. So she had a job working there, and the
Within
work
the
seemed
same
interesting.
company?
And same company, still at Procter and Gamble.
Okay.
And so the ability to get to work with her and be in this new role seemed really interesting. So I jumped at it, got the role. The company relocated me to Boston, and then I was only there for 6 months. And I was only there for 6 months because at that time I had been at my level for 2.5 years. It was communicated through the review process that I would be promoted at around like the 2.5 year mark, which was not lightning fast, but it wasn't super slow. It was kind of around average. And that had been aligned with my new manager who I was going to work with again. But then like more senior people in the function had kind of started slow walking my promotion. And we're like, well, I don't know about that. And basically one thing that was at the time, I don't know if it's that way now, it was very common at Procter & Gamble. When you're getting promoted, there's a lot of discretion within your org. It's not just like, hey, people at this job at this time get promoted if they meet these expectations. They're also looking at who else is getting promoted. Like, how would that make them feel if you got promoted 3 months before them? And I want to do these all at the same time, even if one person is ahead of the other person by X amount of months. And at that point, I was like, I want to be assessed on what I deliver, not like how you want to group me with other people for promotion. And another person who I'd worked with while at Procter & Gamble left and went to PepsiCo. And she was recruiting for someone to come work for her. And the job was in New York. And they were going to give me the stripe. I was an associate manager, and the role she was going to give me, technically it wasn't a manager yet, but she said you'd be promoted within 6 months. And she's like, trust me, if I tell you you're going to be promoted in 6 months, you'll be promoted in 6 months. I took the job. And in 6 months, I didn't say a word. I got a letter. She called me in her office, gave me a letter. Here's your promotion.
Wow.
So at Procter & Gamble, it had been communicated. And when your manager communicates something like you at Procter & Gamble, they're not just talking to themselves. They've aligned it. But they kind of changed stuff on me. And then I went to PepsiCo. And when they told me I was going to get the promotion, and my new boss's, her VP, was one of these people that she had the weight. So she said, you're going to get promoted in 6 months. You can get promoted in 6 months.
Wow.
And that's what happened. And it was a great move, quite frankly. I moved there and I was on a much smaller team that was building out the capability that I had been doing at P&G. They had a lot of visibility. I got to interact with executives at levels that I didn't even come close to when I was at Procter & Gamble, internally at the company and at the customers. I was presenting. In that job, I met the CEO of Walgreens, the president of Dollar General, the EVP, SVP of you name the retailer, and I was in the room with them. Was I always presenting and like the center of the meeting? By no means. But just to be able to be in there to see the questions they were asking, how they thought about their business, it was like an education like no other. And I don't think I would have gotten anywhere else unless I was in that unique role in that team at PepsiCo that was being formed and being built out. And so, yeah, it was a big plus for me. And I didn't realize it until afterwards.
Wow. And I mean, so far, you know, your career is off to a great start, right? Like you have two really brand name companies that you can really utilize and leverage and learn from all of the resources that come with that, right? First at Procter & Gamble, and as you said, like they have every product under the sun basically covered, and you can learn about what that looks like there, and then take your skill sets and apply that in another setting and see how that manifests there. And it's just interesting, you know, that of course every company is going to have different styles, which I think is also one of the reasons why it's important to switch jobs, to learn about how other companies do things and how what you can learn from the people there, from the practices there, from the resources there. Every next move is not always going to be linearly better, right? But there are things that you can learn from each of those experiences. So it sounds like your career is off to a great start there.
100% about what you learn from different places. Procter & Gamble was very technical in their education, especially because they hire so many people right out of school. I was in a new hire class of 25 plus market researchers where we had 18 months of classroom education. So like for the first 6 months, 1 week of every month, you're in a training facility with your peers being taught the like ins and outs of how to do market research, because very few of us actually even took a course in market research in college. The business majors probably took one course, and a lot of us were non-business majors and never took any. And so I literally was taught in a classroom and then would have real world experience in my day-to-day job. PepsiCo didn't really have that because that's not how they hired. That wasn't their strategy. But what I got there was like a business strategy education at the foot of senior executives at PepsiCo and senior executives at some of the country's biggest retailers. I couldn't have architect that better. It just, I was very lucky to be in the right place at the right time and make the right relationship with the right people.
Got it. So how are you judged and evaluated as a market researcher?
It's funny, depends where you are. So some places you're judged on giving the marketer what they ask you for and how quickly can you do it and does it help support their point of view. And that is, I'd say that might be the majority of places. And you can push them a little bit, but don't like go too far off to something they totally be like, I don't know how to make sense of this, or it totally is the opposite of kind of my mental model for this business. And so you very much are a service function to a marketer. Definitely where I work now, that is not the case. And a lot of places I've worked more recently, that's not the case. And I definitely would not say that's the case for a PepsiCo either. And really what market research is a strategy function that uses research as its superpower, but really is focused on helping you not only understand your consumer and the marketplace, but helping you understand what are the right levers to drive your ultimate business goal. So how do you make the consumer feel X way about you, which we know has a strong relationship to how they'll behave in market, whether that means they're using your app or they're making a purchase at your store or they're buying your product.
So tell me what happens within PepsiCo. How long were you there and what comes after that?
So I was at PepsiCo for 2 years the first time. So I was a boomerang. I eventually came back there. And after getting what was a phenomenal kind of education in business strategy, a recruiter approached me and said, hey, Nestle's food division based in LA is looking to start the same type of group, but they need a leader for the group. And it'd be a chance to pivot from being an individual contributor to a people manager, and not as a people manager, but like literally build the team from scratch.
Wow.
So I thought, whoa, that could be interesting. At this point, I'm not even really at the 5-year mark. I'm like 4.5 years of working. I got the job at Nestle and I relocated to LA. I'd never lived in California. I'd only been to California maybe 2 times prior to that. And one of those was a layover when I was a kid.
Wow.
So I did not have much experience there. So it was like fish out of water. I'm moving to Los Angeles. I found an apartment and I start this job. And Nestle's very different than Pepsi, a little similar to P&G, but in the sense that there's a lot of people who work there for a very long time. So it kind of is almost like a family. So you're coming into this family and I have this new area that's being built out. I had a really good manager, which was it's not a saving grace, but was really important, who had been there a very long time. And he was one of those people who, if you're going to bring on a new person to an org that has like just a lot of legacy people, he was like the right manager to have. And so he made it kind of seamless because I could see easily coming into that organization and be like, the organ gets rejected because it's like, who are you? Where are you from? Like, do you even know how we're run? And he knew exactly how they were run and could coach me in a way to bring in this new perspective, but do it in a way where it would actually be leveraged. And it was surprisingly like a pretty easy transition. One thing that did happen at first that gave me a little pause, but I think was the right thing, I was hired to lead this team. And when I got there, I knew they'd already had one person that was supposed to report into me. And when I first got there, my manager said, I'm not going to have that person report into you at first. Let's just wait a little bit. And basically it was because I was so junior and I don't think they thought they would hire somebody that junior. And I said, okay, even though initially when I had been interviewing for the job, this person was supposed to report to me. I didn't make a big thing of it. That person and I still had to work together. So we worked together and a couple things played out. My manager got to see how I operated, to see that if I was mature enough to manage somebody who'd already been there. And this person was very experienced, decades of experience. This person also is just one of those types of people who didn't get caught up on who he was reporting to. He was like a team player about the work, but just very collegial. So we both worked really well together before I was assigned to be his manager. So at that point, my boss was like, okay, he can report to you. And nothing changed from there. And we worked really, really well together. And I think it was a sign of kind of both our maturities. My maturity in that I can be kind of a new manager and know that there's a lot that I can learn from this person. even though there's direction I need to give because I'm getting information fed into me, but there's a lot I can learn from him. And that's how I approached it. And he also approached it with, if he wanted to be in a role that was more senior to mine, he could have been, but it was a choice he made in how he wanted to manage his career. So it was his choice. It wasn't like something had happened to him.
That makes sense.
And we were able to work really well together, and I learned a lot from him. And we got a lot of, as you say, points on the board partnering together. And then over time, I built out a team of about 7 people. Again, pre-COVID, but I had a team that was distributed. Some people were in the office with me in LA. Some people were in other offices that Nestle had around the country, and was able to make a lot of impact and work with a lot of retailers and start to grow this capability within Nestle's food division. And I was there for about 3.5 years before I decided that I wanted to leave and get back to the East Coast and closer to family and get back to New York, where I had a lot of friends, and which is only, a couple hours from Philly. And so I took an individual contributor role and went back to the East Coast. So I went from managing a team and in an org that I knew really well. And like I said, it was a family, and I felt like they kind of welcomed me into that family. And it honestly wasn't the best decision, but it was like everything happens for a reason. I took the job. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't good. It was not a growth opportunity. I didn't grow. I didn't feel like I had the ability to gain new skills. And then during that same period of time, the company I went to Kraft Foods, went through a major transformation. The company split in two.
Wow.
I'd never been at a company that had this happen before. And it was basically financial engineering, but they split apart the traditional food business from their snacks business. And a lot of people lost their jobs. I found out that I wasn't going to lose my job, but at the same time, I was looking for an exit and found it. But I will say the job was not taxing the way other jobs had been. So it gave me a chance for a bit of renewal. And I took it for that. And I ended up going to nonprofit for about 1.5 years at Teach for America, which is the same time when we connected at Columbia, because I thought at that time, I'm going to go into nonprofit, let me get a master's in public administration while I'm at Teach for America. And, all those things will come together. And I was at Teach for America in marketing. So I wasn't teaching. And they had a decent sized marketing department. And I led up marketing insights for them, helped them understand how to help recruit future core members, how to reach out to donors, how to just build their brand broadly, as well as do polling of kind of the issues that were important to them and their senior leaders to understand how they were in the minds of constituents in key markets. So it was a really broad job that got me into a lot of different areas I hadn't been in before, in a space I felt really passionate about. I still, outside of that role, I was on the board of a charter school, had been on the board of my undergrad and the prep school I graduated from. So I've been involved in a lot in education. And personally, it was very fulfilling. But I learned during that time that my heart was still for a full-time job in packaged goods and within the marketing space. So I went back to PepsiCo after 1.5 years. And
did you go back based on some of the same people that you were working with before, like being there, or were you just completely blindly thinking about places that you would want to go back to?
If I can leave everybody with one thing, the network you build, your network is your network. Like the first time I was at PepsiCo, I was only a couple years out of college. I made some relationships with people where I just stayed in touch with them, and they knew the work that I did because of how I operated. So I didn't know. And the person who recommended me to eventually become my boss was a colleague who was more senior than me. I didn't report to him, but we formed a great relationship. He had told another exec at PepsiCo that I was good. And at one point, they tried to bring me over when I was trying to come back to the East Coast. It didn't work out. And then I saw a role pop up online that I thought was in the group of the person I had been connected with through the former colleague. And I reached out to that person and said, hey, just seeing how things are going. He's like, it's so funny you reach out to me. We have this role open on the team. Are you looking at it all? I was like, yeah, I actually am open to opportunities. I'd love to come back to PepsiCo. We spoke. He brought me in for the interview. He was the boss of the person I'd be reporting to. He had me meet with that person. It was like one of those interviews where it's kind of, unless something totally blew up, it was kind of my job to have, because I'd already worked there. I had a reputation. And so I got the job, and I went back to PepsiCo this time as a director, and which I was not before. I went back to PepsiCo, went to that team, After about a year, they restructured. Then I reported to the VP, who was the one who brought me in, who had heard about me through the other colleague. And it was a great experience. It was a different type of education. I was there 3.5 years. I ended up having 3 different roles while I was there.
While you were going to grad school?
So much. While I was going to grad school, too. I graduated from grad school while I was at PepsiCo. I started while I was a Teach for America. So I was able to do that. And it all just fell into place. And it was because I had made this relationship with someone before who I didn't work for. They had put me in contact with someone else. It didn't work out, but I kept nurturing that relationship and then reached back out when there was an opportunity and kept my eyes open to see if there ever was one, was able to go back there. And that VP, there are some things today, some words he said to me and some of the coaching he gave that I still think of today. Like one of his biggest observations for me was he would say, you need to wait a little bit before you go from the balcony to the stage. Meaning like, don't be so quick to like operationalize the plan, like step back and stay back for a bit to make sure you understand the whole situation and can really deliver like strategic value versus, oh, I can go off and do this thing and I can build out a plan and I'll execute it on time. But if you haven't fully grasped the situation, you may be building the wrong plan. I literally think about that all the time. He was a very hands-off manager because again, at this time I'm a director, he's a VP, he has a broad scope. And he just gave you sticks. And then you learn that you're getting your feedback and the pushes you need, sometimes from him, but from a lot of other people. So that when you go back to him, you could say, I spoke to all these people, got all their perspective. So I never would have like these long feedback sessions with him where he's like taking a red pen. Like if that had happened, I probably would have had issues. But it was like, if you go into all these people and gotten their perspective, by the time you get to him, he's like fine tuning it. Because he knows what's happening in the org to make sure it can like navigate properly. And I learned so much from him and from that second time around at PepsiCo, but it was a very different experience. As
someone that I know at the time that you started, you were in nonprofit. So in your mind was like, okay, maybe I'll stick around in nonprofit world. But, typically I would imagine someone in your world to want to go for like an MBA, right? Or something that was more profit driven. So help me understand what you hoped to get out of your master's program and what you actually got out of it. And if it made sense for you to have done that.
Great question. It was somewhat non-traditional for me to go, when you look at my background, and say, why'd he go get an MPA, not an MBA? I was deciding between an MPA at Columbia and an MBA at NYU Stern. And it became a dollars and cents. I was looking at part-time programs for both. Because at this point in my career, I was not going to go back full-time. That didn't feel like the right thing to do. Because if I had gone back full-time to an MBA program, I would have come out to an MBA entry-level role, which would have been junior to what I already was in my industry. Makes sense. That would be a step back. So I just worked too long to go back full time. And then I was like, I think I just need a master's degree. Like these senior level roles, they kind of just put down, master's degree, either required or preferred. And in my head, I was like, I just got to make the algorithm work a little bit better for me if I'm applying to a job online. Granted, I had a lot of jobs that I did not apply to online, but in my head, I was like, this just feels like something to round out my experience. And I thought at that point, it didn't matter if it was an MBA or an MPA. It just needed to be from a good school and be a master's and have some content that would be valuable to me. Like I needed an accounting class. I'd never taken accounting. I didn't want to be an accountant, but I needed to understand stuff like that. So I judged between those two programs, and NYU was double the price. And in my head, I couldn't justify spending double the price for an MBA versus an MPA from Columbia. So I opted for Columbia. And the funny thing is when I graduated, I was at PepsiCo. I wasn't active in the job market. Fast forward a year after I got that degree, I did get a new job, but I was approached by a recruiter. So it wasn't like I had to use the algorithm to get my resume to come to the top. But as luck would have it, my first manager had a very similar degree from another institution. And it allowed us to have like conversations because we both had studied like foreign policy and other things like that. And so I don't think she hired me because of it. It was interesting that the first boss I had post getting that degree had a similar degree and worked in marketing and in tech. And it allowed a kind of fluency for us to talk. And we're still friends to this day. And I know some of the areas that we both find interesting are things that relate to our graduate studies.
Wow. Okay. I mean, it also brought us together. So I'm glad that you went to Columbia. That was
100%.
Yeah, it's certainly the right choice. You made the right choice for sure. But it is always, interesting to hear the perspective, if it has actually paid dividends, right? Because it's a big investment in time. It's a big investment financially. And, especially at that point in your career, it's like you have a lot going on. You have friends, family, things to like do, that dedicating all of your evenings and weekends to a program for a couple of years is not at the top of the list, right? So, I always find it fascinating to hear if people have made direct connections that made it make sense for them, or indirectly. And I'd imagine it certainly doesn't hurt to have a master, especially from a place like Columbia, even if you don't receive a job offer directly through that network or directly with someone saying, because you have this MPA. I think it's one of the ingredients in the recipe that can play in your favor.
Exactly. I think that's the way to look at it. It's the intangibles. So I think in hindsight, would I do it again? Probably. I can't give you direct and say, I learned this thing here and now I do it now. But I can say there are different perspectives that it opened me up to that I do think about in how I do my work now. Like, we could study decision models. I didn't know what that was before I went to Columbia. Understanding that exists, especially in tech, helps my mind just grasp other things about how you would build an algorithm to do something. They're different, but similar. And so it's been helpful in that regard. And just like as a manager, there's no checklist of you do this, this, and this, and you get promoted. And I have to share that perspective all the time. In the same way, there's no checklist that you do this, this, and this in order to have the trajectory you want in your career. So that's one of the things that I think it was important for me to get the grad degree, get it from a great institution, and then figure that out. Are there some people who it may make sense for them to go to get a graduate degree, maybe not from a Columbia, but from some other institution that may not be at least externally seen that way? Potentially, depending on what they want to do, it may be one of those things that makes sense. And for some other people, maybe it doesn't make sense for them to get a graduate degree at all. And so it all depends, but it's not a checklist. It's not like Ivy League master's degree, check. There are tons of people who I can show you within our organization who don't have a master's degree or graduate or undergrad degree from an Ivy League institution, and they are wildly successful. And there's some other thing that is what got them there. A lot of times skill, but maybe companies they work for where they attain a certain skill or stuff they've learned internally while working at a Meta. So it's not just like, oh, you go do these things and everything works out for you.
So tell me about this recruiter. How did they find you? Or was it someone you already had a relationship with? And what was the actual role?
So I'm at Pepsi. At one point I had said, and I don't even know if I said it to anyone, but I was like, you know what? I'd like to work in tech at some point.
Okay.
And I thought, I was like, if I work in tech, what is I looked on Google's website, are they hiring for any insights role? Because I knew some insights people who had made their way there. I'm like, I was like, I don't know, by the level I got to now, I don't know if it makes sense to go there. But I looked and I kind of said, hey, I want to get into tech. Didn't really put a plan at that point together.
Well, you put it in the universe.
Then I put it in the universe. Definitely put it in the universe. I know, at least to myself, I put it out there. And I one day get this email through LinkedIn from a recruiter from Dropbox. And she asked, could she chat? In my head, I initially thought she wanted to network with me to find someone in my network for some open roles she had. Then she starts to talk to me about Dropbox and the role. And I start thinking, who do I know who could be a good fit? And then she's like, would you be interested? And I'm like, me? Oh, I didn't even think about me. I was like, sure, I'd be interested. So she sets up a call with the hiring manager. And at this point, there's a fast track on the process because the hiring manager is about to go off on a 6-week sabbatical. And so they kind of start fast tracking. I met with the hiring manager. We had a good conversation. She wanted to move me forward. They said, how quickly can you be out here for a face-to-face day of interviews and put together a presentation, which is something I didn't do in my past life. And CPG, I was never asked to put together a presentation. So this is new to me. I was like, I can be out there in a couple of weeks. So in a couple of weeks, I come out. The hiring manager at this point is on sabbatical in Japan. And I am doing my rounds of interviews. And a couple of days later, they reach out and say, we want to give you the offer. And I'm like, what? This happened. I mean, I don't think this interview process took 4 to 6 weeks tops from start to finish, which is lightning fast. My head kind of flew and I got the offer to come start up their market research group. They kind of had one before, but it kind of went away. And I was going to reconstitute it and build out their market research group. And the funny thing was, it was not a director role. And And in CPG, it's kind of like a big deal to finally get to be a director. And I was like, you know what? The comp is good. I'll take the role. I can live without the stripe. And they're like, and the next level is director. So you could get promoted. And I can touch on that later. But I went on faith and said, don't get caught up on the title. And I didn't. And I took the role. It was probably the best decision I could have ever made in my career.
I love that for you. I think that's really important in recognizing the opportunity, not just financial, like not attached to the brand and to kind of the financial perception that comes with it, right? So similarly, I know I've certainly taken roles that I knew made sense for where I knew my career was going, but title-wise, it may have seemed like either a demotion or I'm not going to take a pay cut, period. That's not me. But people externally may not know that. So you may look at my title and say, wait, weren't you just a director? And now you're, sure, Radhy, if that's what you're doing. But it's like, no, everything else is aligning with where I know I'm going. So I think that's super important for you to have recognized that. And I would love to hear about kind of how you came to terms with that. And I know you ultimately did become a director. And this specific role was back in the West Coast, right?
Back on the West Coast. So moving back to the West Coast, moved to the Bay Area this time. And the recruiter had told me, hey, director in tech is different than director in CPG. And then I started just doing my own research. At the end of the day, I'm a market researcher, heavy emphasis on research. And this is something I do for all roles and something I kind of always just do in general. There's a lot of data out there on compensation, and you can also go on LinkedIn and see people in different roles. And I was able to see that a lot of the people who had reached director level at a lot of the larger tech companies, at least, had significant amount of experience, and that they might be more senior than a director at a PepsiCo. I also was able to see that the comp for directors in tech was very different than the comp for directors in CPG. So that it was like, well, where they have me lined up does feel right. And there's one thing in tech that can be very confusing. This term head of this, head of that can actually mean very little. You could be very senior and be a head of, you could be very junior and be a head of. And I had to kind of erase that and just kind of look at the scope of the role, who it reported to, how it fit into the structure, to say that this feels like a role that is commensurate with my level of experience, but it also feels like a role where I can grow. And if I am moving into a different industry, how could I expect to then almost be promoted in, which would be getting a director level role right away. But fast forward, I was promoted to director after a year and then received another promotion another 2 years later to senior director. And my scope grew from when I started, there was one person that reported to me and I built out a team, did research, to I built out it through restructuring and some other things. I ended up having a team of 30 plus people across multiple different functional areas, research being one of them, but other areas as well. And I don't know if that ever would have happened in CPG. This is not how it worked. And it definitely not how it worked for me. Going out on just faith, but also doing my due diligence, it was the best move I could have made to be able to make that switch over. And by the time I left, I knew so much more about the tech industry, about the type of business that Dropbox was in, which is SaaS, software as a service, understanding different approaches to selling, like selling through inbound, like where people just come to your website versus selling with a sales team. I just gained so much valuable experience and made some really, like, definitely some lifetime friendships and just some professional connections that are invaluable. That network of people who've gone through Dropbox is just top notch.
Tell me a little bit about what you appreciated or learned from those other functions that you were overseeing in your time there, right? Because as you said, it's not just a new industry, but it's also not just market research, which is what you've built your career and got your chops in, right? Like now you're overseeing other things that may be a little bit outside your comfort zone, and there lies the growth, right? So tell me about that process and what you were able to gain from that moment.
Really, it was just trying to understand, like, what did we need collectively? Because I became the head of marketing strategy and operations. And it was like, how do all these disparate functions work together to help us develop the right plan and then deliver against it? And some of that came from just like, I always said early on, I wanted to be a politician. And one part of being a politician is listening to what different constituents want and then trying to build a plan. Within marketing at Dropbox, it was, what do our different partners in the company need? How does the company operate? And how do we work to develop a plan and deliver those parts of the company what they need? And then how do we use these different functions within marketing, like analytics, like strategy or research to help put together a plan in partnership with other marketing leaders to give our stakeholders what they need. How do we give customer experience what they need for marketing? How do we give outbound sales what they need for marketing? How do we help the growth team get what they need from marketing? And it really just turned into try to understand what people bring to the table, whether those were functions that I technically managed or other teams, and then figure out how do you get a plan together, and then how do you turn that plan, like they say, turn a bill into a law? How do you then execute? And that's what I focused on. And it really is a lot built on relationship. And then how do you motivate folks to work together and know that I definitely can't do it by myself? This is not going to be me sitting in a room hammering out a plan and having it be successful. It's like there are a bunch of people here who are really smart. How do I just create a framework for us to work together? And so a lot of it turned into creating, I don't even want to call them processes, but just creating space and lightweight processes for us to be able to get the work done.
Wow. Okay. That makes sense. Now you're in tech, which you wanted and the universe heard from you. You're 3 years into the role. What are you thinking is the next growth point for you? What would you be looking for in a new role? What does that look like?
So around 3-year mark, I'm helping onboard a new CMO who just joined the company, which was an interesting experience in itself, helping onboard a CMO. And this is a senior level exec who's coming in, and my job is to help make her be successful. It was somebody with a lot of great experience who had great ideas and how to help make that transition as easy as possible, but then also just help her execute the plan, because they brought her in because they saw something in her that we needed as a company, and I wanted to help bring that to fruition. So that's happening. Around that time, I kept thinking, like, what do I want to do? We have a new leader coming on board. I'm sure at some point she's going to ask me, like, what are you interested in? And then I thought to myself, it's like, I kind of like my old job. What my old job was just focused on research, because this broader job turned into one where it was fun, but I also knew in my heart of hearts, like where like my heart lied, which was doing market research and helping inform strategy. And I said to myself, I was like, you know what? I'd love to lead market research at a big tech company for like one of their divisions or one of their apps. Like, I don't want to do like it functionally, because there's a lot of administrative overhead that comes with that. I'd love to just do it for like a specific area of the company, like a division. Put that out in the universe. It happened again. Recruiter calls me. Mind you, this time the recruiter first reached out like a few weeks before COVID. And in the midst of my transition of helping the transition process with the new CMO, we spoke briefly, and they're like, oh, this is a long process. We're just starting. I'm like, good, because I'm not like in any rush. I'm in the middle of this transition. And so it was cool. We spoke. She's like, at some point we'll reach back out. I go back to doing my day job, which I was very much focused on. We find out about, COVID is coming. The Bay Area is one of the first areas to shut down. I'm now working with a new CMO, trying to transition to help her kind of bring her vision to life while everybody's getting used to remote work. Nobody knows how long it's going to be. And then the meta recruiter reached back out and said, I think we're going to fast track the process. We want to bring you to the next round. I'm like, okay. So I'm juggling both. And then my process with meta slowed down a little bit because, COVID was rearing its head and slowing that down. But by late April, I got an offer.
2020.
And 2020. And
Wow.
to lead marketing insights for WhatsApp. So a division or app within a larger research function of one of the big tech companies, at least as it was called then, one of the FANGs. And I was like, whoa, talk about manifesting again. Like, this happened the second time in a row. And so I felt like I had to take it. Like, I really was thinking I was going to probably transition to a different role in maybe another year, but decided to take the role because, like, I don't know how often this is going to come up. And I took it, and best decision I could have made. Just looking at like on so many levels. I've learned a lot in this role. It just moved me to a company that I think for me is probably a place I would be a lot longer, just because of the size and scale and the different types of opportunities I would be able to take advantage of. And it was hard leaving Dropbox, because it was one of those places where it felt like I don't know if there'll ever be a place that felt like Dropbox felt. And part of that was also because it was pre-COVID. It was a very office-based environment. They're now totally remote. But then the office culture at Dropbox, I mean, if you put that in a bottle, people would probably pay you tons of money for it. It was the most unique environment I've ever been in. And for transition to a new industry, to a new city, it was phenomenal. I couldn't ask for a better place to work. But as I was thinking about just my career, I just wanted to be in a place where I could just focus on the work and not all of the work about work. And I had created a role at Dropbox that really was about the work about work. Most roles at Dropbox are not about the work about work, but strategy and operations in many organizations, not unique to Dropbox, is the work about work. It's the people who help try to figure out how to get things done. You're like a fixer. You're like, how do I get these teams to work together to deliver a plan and then measure to see if we hit our results? And it was interesting, but I was like, I don't think I want to do this forever. I could see a point in time where I'd do it again for maybe another couple of years. But long term, I felt like going back to kind of my roots, so to speak, and doing a market research role was kind of where I wanted to get back to.
First of all, I want to acknowledge that you have very much owned your career since the beginning, right? You've been deliberate about going out and seeking new roles or being responsive when a recruiter in another role contacted you and weighing what that all meant, right? Like a lot of times there were many opportunities for you to say no. And you went from Philadelphia, college in Connecticut, let's move to Cincinnati. Ooh, let's go to Boston and take this opportunity. Then we're going to grow in our careers and go to New York and stay a couple of years there and then say, you know what, let's go to LA. Let's go back to New York. Let's go to the Bay Area, right? And these are all opportunities to grow within your career that you could have said no to a lot of times. So, I do want to acknowledge that, there's a lot of guts that comes with that. And there's a lot of, you're clearly a strategic thinker, the strategy that comes with that. But just the ability to manage and own your career like that is impressive. As you're navigating that, what does that look like from a compensation standpoint, right? Like if you are taking roles in different parts of the country, in market research, right? In different industries, different sectors, nonprofit, tech, consumer goods, like how lucrative of a career can this be as you continue to grow in your career, at different points and at different stages in different industries and different markets?
First, I'd say is like one of the things I always took into account is like, what could I learn? What would be the size of the opportunity? And was it a place where I'd be surrounded with the types of people that would foster that learning? So even in places where I didn't think I had the best opportunity, I was still surrounded by really smart people who I could still learn something from, which then turns into value that can be monetized when you're going other places and they're looking at your skills and they're evaluating, like, are you coming from a strong organization? Or are you coming from a place where you probably weren't put that much? So I think that gets into play. So there definitely are opportunities out there that I turned down where the comp was either just as good and sometimes better, but it felt like, I don't know if I learned anything there. Like, I don't know, quite frankly, what's the caliber of the folks who are at that organization versus the caliber of the people at the organizations I might go to. But then I'll tell you that different industries compensate differently. So like at one point I interviewed for a role at a major retailer, Fortune 50 company, but the compensation was dramatically different than CPG. And I turned down an offer. I thought there might be something I could learn there, but I wasn't convinced because maybe that could have been something that maybe would have think about it, but it really wasn't. And I turned it down and ended up waiting and got a job someplace else. And it was a much better fit and it was better compensation. But I'll also say that I went to nonprofit from for-profit and I took a pay cut, significant. I know that there's certain things I learned in that nonprofit role at Teach for America that in addition to fitting into my passion, I could not have gotten that in the role that I was in at the company I was at prior. There are key things that allowed me to speak to in future interviews, even when I got a Dropbox, that were invaluable. And again, the caliber of people I was working with were top notch. In tech, I will say tech definitely compensates very differently than any of the other companies I've been in. And it's just the nature of the beast. Like it has profit margins that are much better than packaged goods like PepsiCo and P&G. It has growth that folks just don't see. In addition to having higher margins, just the overall sales growth number are numbers that I don't know if CPG has experienced, at least in my lifetime. So it's just a very different structure. You also have considerable more equity, so you have more skin in the game. And what I would say overall is to even be able to understand it, because coming in, I did not understand. The first time when I went to Dropbox and they explained my package to me, I technically thought I was like being underpaid. And it's because I was so ignorant to what the package was and how equity even worked. Like I had equity at PepsiCo, but it was such a small portion of my compensation. It took so long for it to vest. You almost viewed it as like not even being real compensation. It was like funny money. And they started hacking away at it. So they even gave you even less overtime and like told you to be happy about it. And so once I fully understood it, then I could go out and better benchmark it too. And one thing about tech is folks will post their salary all over the internet. So you can go out on different sites and find out like about compensation. The really helpful sites are places like levels.fyi, where you can look at different tech companies and look at the levels compared to each other, and then look at the salary ranges of those levels up against each other. Because again, even a director at one tech company is not a director at another tech company. And so you can then see how those levels match up and then what those compensation bands are. And that's really helpful. And then also understanding the trajectory of a company's stock. You go to a company with a great base salary and a ton of stock, but their stock has historically underperformed. That number that they're getting quoted at first might decline over time, meaning that your comp from year to year can fluctuate dramatically depending on how the stock performs. So you can think at the beginning of the year, based on the stock price, I'm going to make X amount of money. Stock goes down a lot, made a lot less. Or if stock goes up a lot, you made a lot more than you were expecting. So that's one thing for folks to kind of get used to when thinking about it. But it definitely is different in a good way. But it's one of those things where you still have to do the due diligence to make sure you are being fairly compensated. But two, make sure you're going to a place where you're going to learn something. Because if you're ever looking for a future opportunity, you may have gone someplace with a big price tag at first, but then other recruiters may be like, well, their salaries are inflated, their roles are inflated, the talent level there is not that high. We bring them in, we may have to do a lot of skilling. So it's also good to also think about what are those other intangibles. And the last thing I'll leave on that front is I went to Dropbox before they IPO'd. So going to a place that's pre-IPO and still private is very different than going to a place that's already public. And that's because the stock and equity you get from pre-IPO, it's an illiquid asset for the most part, meaning you can be vesting a ton of it, but until they go public or they're acquired, you can't do anything with that. And there's a few places where you can sometimes trade that on a really private market, but that's really challenging. And that's typically for like founders. It's definitely something to consider too.
Got it. Is there also a bonus structure that's tied to your performances in this field?
Most places that are public, yes. If places aren't public, it's there might be, there might not be. It all depends.
Got it. Okay. So that's helpful. Tell me, you walk into work on a Monday. What are you doing?
Walking to work on a Monday, typically I would triage emails before I got there Sunday night. And triaging emails, I'm not getting a ton of emails over the weekend, but there are some, depending on people working over the weekends, but also people in different time zones. So I'm trying not to walk in surprises on Monday morning. And typically I'll have a few meetings. And the way my day works is typically front loaded. I work with people from all over the globe, but a lot of people kind of acquiesce to the Bay Area time zone a lot because the company's headquartered there. So my meetings start anywhere from 8:30 to 9 is the first, and then goes kind of through like early afternoon. And then typically later in the day, I have time like for focus. And then I always try to block out time for lunch because people will easily go over that just because, it may not be their lunchtime. But I think having that time, I may or may not eat lunch, but I need to check in. Did I get some emails? Because I'm not looking at emails 24/7 because I have all these other meetings going on. So another chance to check in on emails and just see if anything else that needs my attention, like urgently. And then by the end of the day, I'm able to wrap up and like just take in like what else does something need to be reviewed, cleaning up my inbox, answering some chats that I couldn't get to while I was in meetings. And I'll do that, up through 5. And then typically 3 to 4 nights, definitely probably Monday night, 3 to 4 nights a week, I'll put in a few hours at night, typically reviewing documents, on occasion, like composing something, but a lot of times more of my work is shifting through like reviewing something, giving feedback and doing things like that.
When you say reviewing stuff, it's just like, I imagine market research, very Excel heavy, very data driven, like looking at a bunch of data and trying to make sense of it and coming up with a narrative that comes with that. Or am I completely misled by watching Mad Men?
There would be folks on my team who do that. A lot of times I'm looking at the end reports, seeing like, does this make sense? Do I have other questions? And how to like ask questions to further tease out like different answers that we may need to communicate. So at this point, I'm rarely in Excel and almost always in either a Google Doc, like a Word doc, or like a Google presentation, Google Slides, and looking through to see like what's the story that people are putting together. I'm also looking a lot of times at people's plans. Like I'm looking at research plans on how people are going to go about answering a strategic question. And that's what I end up spending most of my time reviewing. A lot of the folks on the team, they may be in Excel, and sometimes we hire vendors who may do a lot of that. And so they're also working on presentations and reports more so than needing to go in and analyze the data. And I'll say that's unique because at Dropbox, we did more of that work in-house. So there'd be a mix of people being literally knee deep in Excel as well as knee deep in like Google Slides.
Are there any forms of media, books, movies, shows, podcasts that you listen to or read that have shaped you personally or professionally?
There's a lot of podcasts I listen to. I just try to stay up on current events because those things end up having something that impacts your business. So I listen to The Daily a lot. Wall Street Journal has a podcast where they put out 1 or 2 episodes a day. I also listen to Pivot. It's Swisher and Scott Galloway. She's a longtime tech reporter. He's a marketing professor. So I listen to that a lot. I also just read a lot of news. I try to stay up on what's going on, look at Google News and see a lot of the headlines and read articles that are of interest. I have a New York Times and a Wall Street Journal subscription. And so I'm looking at headlines and digging into articles there, but just trying to stay aware of what's going on. And then by way of reading, I'm really into nonfiction. So I love biographies. I'll look at biographies of, well-known people in business and not necessarily say, I don't often read like business books in the sense of how to write a great marketing strategy, but I want to read a book about, a well-known, like I've read a book about the House of Morgan. So all the folks who helped form like Morgan Stanley and JP Morgan to learn about that family and understand that type of stuff is really of interest to me.
Is there anything else we haven't discussed today that the world should know about Michael?
I would say, I think it's just really important you don't have to have like a step-by-step plan. And at one point I thought that was necessary, but like, what are the attributes of the type of role you want to have? What are the types of things that give you energy? And start to figure out a plan that way for how you want to manage your career and think about everything about like, how do you give yourself the most options as opposed to like, I don't think it has to be super calculated, but it definitely has to be intentional. And so that's been something I've kind of focused on. And I can't tell you exactly what I'm going to do in 5 years, but I know generally the types of jobs I want to have in 5 years and in my 40s and where I see my career going in my 50s. And I'm not going to be limiting to say it's going to be this one thing, but I will, always try to manifest, what I think that next role is.
Love it. Okay. Thanks for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Radhy.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and believe on the mission we're on, please like, rate, and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're using, and share this podcast with your friends in your networks. Make sure you follow us on Instagram and LinkedIn at Career Cheat Code, and tell us people or careers you would like to see highlighted. See you next week with some more cheat codes. Peace.